She made the most imaginative dresses, other than Schiaparelli, before the World War II.
And what did you think of Shocking Pink?
I never noticed it.
Schiaparelli you admired a great deal?
Very much.
And Balenciaga?
I liked her. I didn't only admire her.
Was she a wonderful person?
Wonderful.
What was the basis of your relationship?
Mutual admiration of techniques we innovated. When Mrs. Vreeland cuts me out of an exhibition of innovators' work, it makes me laugh, because when I think that Schiaparelli thought I was a great innovator, you really couldn't compare the opinion of Schiaparelli with that of a hack editor.
Balenciaga also respected and admired you.
Yes, I didn't know him, but he thought of me with, one could almost say, tenderness.
As does Hubert de Givenchy, who told me he admired you greatly. He told me personally, as Yves Saint Laurent.
Yes, I know. I've remained a myth because people don't see evidence of my work enough. I don't have the workers I need.
Could you possibly get the workers you need today, or they're simply not trained artisans?
No, with a backer, I could. I wouldn't even draw on the labor pool. I'd train people from scratch.
What would it cost to put Charles James back into business?
Couple of $100,000.
And what would you set out to create? What would you want to do? Would you be creating just dresses for museums? Would you want to be creating dresses for people, for the masses?
Dresses go into museums once they've been created for people. What's taken up by the market is destroyed by the market. As Schiaparelli told me years ago, once something is popular, make a new thing. It's dead.
And once you've made it for specialized clients or individual people, often your designs have been adapted to be made to be mass-produced and sold.
What else could be?
Well, you sold that marvelous little shirt, I guess, for what, $4.99?
Yeah, but what else could be adapted for mass production, excepting the new thing, which can only come from work for individuals?
Have you harbored a collection of designs that you have ready to be created for the masses to be produced?
Yes, I've got an awful lot stashed away and partly made, you know. In London, my English fitter has kept a large sack of what we call ébauche, dresses that are muslins which have not been yet resolved. I've often thought that the American fashion market puts out ébauche, not garments.
Is it still your goal then to start again to be mass produce?
To continue and enlarge.
That's still your goal.
I never stopped.
Would you prefer? I would almost prefer to see you continuing only creating for a few special clients and not being involved in the mass producing, which is run such dangerous risks.
The clients who've been much publicized lately, the people that are known by readers, for instance, of your columns. Your columns, I use the plural on purpose. They are like the dress already developed. They're already known and done for. I would want new people.
And yet you know many of the current personalities, and how it wasn't too long ago that Bianca Jagger came down and expressed an interest to study.
I don't really know her. She expressed an interest to study, quite insincerely. She hasn't the time to study.
Do you think she's one of the world's great beauties at this time? Were you impressed with her?
No, I think she's very nice looking. She looks like a Nicaraguan beauty with some degree of old blood. When she does her hair seriously, she looks much better than when it's done like girls of 17. She's a wonderful figure.
Would you like to make clothes for her? Is she the type of woman that has inspired you over the years, such as Millicent Rogers, Gypsy Rose Lee,
you
Anna
can't
Q.
compare
Nelson?
People like that. Millicent Rogers was more romantic. she had a far wider range.
Let's talk about some of the eccentric clients. Some of the
Well,
some of the things, some of
they're
the fun
the
things that you've
wonderful
done.
there was one client who Partos, who works at Bergdorf in the fur department, knew when he was at Dior. And she used to come twice a week and have a fitting room engaged for the day. She'd come quite early in the morning. Her maid would produce a corset for every other hour of the day. So she fitted things from really 10 in the morning to the time the house closed. She had nowhere to wear them at all. And when she came back to America, she had to hire a suite to put all her wardrobe in, which she never wore anywhere, listing it night after night.
Who was this, Charles?
I can't remember her name.
Whatever happened to
She
all
was
those
a
wonderful
person who
clothes?
hadn't any name. She just had money.
What happened to all the clothes?
I don't know.
Isn't that funny? What about the client that used to sleep with her head out the window in Paris?
Yeah, she was she was an Argentinian. And she considered kept her young. It was a curious idea to sleep in a glass box attached to the windowsill with holes in it.
I'll say it is. What are some of the other stories? What about the time?
I had a wonderful client whose father was a partner of Woolworth, and she had been encouraged to marry a banker who was at that time a sort of a bank clerk. And as she grew older, she developed a curious set of tastes. She, for instance, really did have a Praxiteles in her rather bourgeois apartment. She had served champagne in golden goblets. And she had a heart-shaped face with dishwater blonde hair. And she's a very romantic person, very demanding. She never placed an order, but she always suggested you made it, as Millicent Rogers did too. And then her maid would call up in 2 days, was it ready? And you didn't really know the order had been properly placed. It was always paid for. But when she died of leukemia through getting thin, the house was so filled with her wardrobe it nearly went under. And she also went nowhere. I think she went to Utica every now and then, where her father come from, because she financed the university, something like that. Partly. We used to call her Mrs. Wonderful Baker. She used to arrive in a big town car in the war when gasoline was rationed, sharply rationed. And she would let it tick, run its motor for hours while she fitted. And it was before the days of air conditioning, so she used to carry an ice bag on her lap. And she used to wear a sort of thé dansant dress of faded chiffon flowers, much like I've seen around lately, and with points all around the skirts. So many young people think they've invented recently.
The handkerchief hemline.
Yeah, but that's been something. I myself made one in 1928 for Genevieve Fox, her debut, Mrs. Littleton Fox's daughter, in Southampton. But Mrs. Baker had an enormous wardrobe of my clothes. I never knew what happened to them.
How many dresses you think you've made over the years, Charles? Because even at your height, you only dressed 10 women. I mean, we must infer that there was some...
No, that isn't quite true. There are times when I dress 10 women, times when I dress 3 women, times when I dress 30. But I don't know, probably 5,000 or 6,000 dresses,
And
right offhand.
And also, I think you've stated before that you haven't really made that many original designs, perhaps.
Many variations of design.
How many original designs do you think you've created, Charles?
Maybe 1,000.
And today, a modern designer might be expected to create 1,000 designs in 5 years.
But they're all alike. They're not on, all his work is alike, but it's also like his neighbors.
Why is that, Charles? Is it a lack of training in the schools?
Fear.
Fear of being rejected? Fear of going out of the middle of the road?
Exactly.
Why is that?
Fear of not being in.
What about the top?
Whereas the real point is to not be in.
What do you think of designers like Saint Laurent, Yves Saint Laurent? Is he
I'm not going
creating
to talk about other designers. It would be very embarrassing. I don't know enough about their work. But I know that the principle of the American designer is all wrong because he's really basically a hired servant. And he would lose his job if he didn't have what his neighbor had.
That's interesting. Let's talk about some of the clients then. What about Anna Q. Nelson? I know you made clothes for her.
She's one of the great movie stars, probably had a bigger audience than anybody has today.
And you made clothes for her in her private life or her
They're not
professional
many,
life?
but
or
I
both?
know always the private life.
How did she happen to come to you?
I even made something for Janet Gaynor. I didn't have many movie people or opera people. If I did, it was purely for their social life and because they were wanting to break into social life.
Well, that's not true, Charles. Now, you've had a lot of, perhaps you don't consider them important, but you did dress a lot of movie stars. What about the time Marlene Dietrich came in to be photographed in a
It
sort
was
of a
only an
side?
accident at Elizabeth Arden's, where I started the department. And she posed to get the page of publicity, wanted to buy the dress, and Miss Arden thought her vulgar and wouldn't sell it.
She didn't like the way she did her hair.
I didn't like the way she did the hair, so I cut it off the top of her head and when I reprinted the picture.
And of course, you did a lot
I
to
would
keep
have
her
loved
happy.
to have dressed Garbo.
You did. I can imagine. It's funny that you didn't cross paths.
She did come to me once with Cecil Beaton, but not to buy, just to be introduced.
Did you know of their affair? Cecil has
But they
written.
never did have an affair,
Well,
I'm
he's
sure
written
that.
they had a mad love affair.
Well, mad love affairs come in many colors.
And that time when Marlene Dietrich came to you, you did a lot to keep her happy. It was terribly hot that day, and didn't you have a big block of ice brought up and a fan set behind it?
I did. It wasn't appreciated at all. That's the way restaurants cool people in Paris used to. Now, I dare say they all have air conditioning now.
And the dress was designed on the bias so that
It was one
Flesh.
piece that wrapped around with a diagonal joint with tags left extended, which could be tied in knots. So you really knotted yourself into the dress.
And you made it, I think, for Dietrich, of course, the flesh would show through, but didn't you make it for someone infinitely more distinguished and sophisticated and quite a bit older?
Oh, yes. Lady Lucia Warner, who was about 70, who was really the most wonderful client I ever had. She'd been a great beauty. She never really lost her beauty. And I put off going to see her on my last trip to England till the very moment, as she was not far from the airfield. I was afraid that she had changed too much and that our relationship had changed. But the English are so different to Americans. You can go away for 20 years and come back and the relationship is exactly the same. and your position is of no importance. And she'd had a stroke, and she could hardly speak, and she'd let her hair go white, much against her principles, because she had Spanish blood, being Irish with Spanish blood, like my mother's father was Irish with Portuguese blood. And Lady Lucia could only get out a few words, and they really, some amounted to that she knew that I would turn up. And I brought all sorts of things with me that you couldn't get in England then, perfumes that had been made in by Guerlain in her youth, and clothes, everything. I took the plane an hour after leaving her, and in mid-flight, when plane service was modern, I got a cable that she died.
Oh.
I was never more touched. For years, for 10 years, I dressed her. And she was afraid for a time that I would want much more money than she could pay. She wasn't poor, but she thought I would be very, very expensive, and I wasn't. And she was brought by an architect, Paul Hislop, who was very well known, and Raymond Mortimer, who was very well known too, a critic, author. And she'd grown to know a whole set of people much younger than herself. She said the old ones were bores. And she gave a party once a year for them. And they would all come in wheelchairs and things. And various duchesses arrived whom one had thought had died long ago, like the Duchess of Grafton, after all a very big name, but I didn't know there was one alive. And they were there, they would sit listening to harpsichord music or something and have
tea.
Yes, with a rather skimpy buffet, and go away and not be seen for another year.
So while you were living this life amidst the famous artists of Paris, participating in the great salons, how did your family feel? Here's a picture of your mother. How did your mother feel? Did she enjoy your success? How did she feel about your being a designer?
She was influenced by my father against me. She was horrified at my making clothes, really. Later, she liked it. But this picture of my mother was taken in a dress, I think, by Doucet, because the family went to Doucet. And not many other houses. And it was taken in '93 for her debut.
Cut. Anton. Hello?
I owed a great deal to certain editors, the like of which don't exist there.
Margaret Chase.
No, Case.
Case. Miss Case of Vogue.
She should have been the head of Vogue. But she stayed on as a sort of social editor and jumped out of a window a few years ago.
Why do you think she did that?
I think she was only too conscious that her world had passed. Of course, Mrs. Vreeland was pushed out of Vogue. This is not generally known, but one day she arrived and all the furniture had been moved out of her room and her secretary was in her place.
As editor-in-chief?
Yeah. But the great editors were people like the Howard sisters on Harper's Bazaar, one in Paris, one in New York. The Paris one had had a temporary career as an opera singer.
A lot of great photographers, too, have influenced your work.
The great photographers were really partners of the editors.
Sir Cecil?
But they're good editors.
Sir Cecil Beaton, you even went to school with him.
Yes, but that didn't influence him very much.
You went both to...
I never can claim to have influenced him. I will say that some of his best work was done with me.
Well, did he influence you?
Nobody made me toe the line. He made me work very hard.
He was a hard worker, strict professional.
Very, very.
Had he been that way since school? You both went to Harrow? Eton?
But he came from a family of a different sort that was in trade.
I don't remember which public school you went to in England.
Harrow.
It was Harrow.
I'd gone to Lake Placid here too.
And so you were fast friends from school days. Did you then talk
Yeah,
of
I went to Lake Placid with the brother, I think he was the brother, of the present Bishop Paulmore of St. John the Divine, whose grandmother backed me later in life.
Mrs. Moore?
Yes. And who was the most extraordinary backer,
She'd sit in-
thinker, judge of everything.
She's the one that used to sit in a wheelchair and send expeditions off to dig up archaeological
Not
treasures
a
in
wheelchair, an armchair,
Egypt.
a rocking chair.
I'm sorry. There is a difference, isn't there?
No, she would fly all over Persia, you know, with my great aunt. She did extraordinary things like that. She used to hire every year for several years the Roebling yacht. You know, the Roeblings built Brooklyn Bridge originally. In the next generation, they had a yacht so big that it remained out of American waters, so they didn't have to pay customs. She called my aunt up one day in Florence, where she'd gone to live. My aunt hung up thinking it was a joke. And the next day, the call came through again, and she said, "Margaret, you must come right back." Now, she just arrived a week before. She said, "You come right back to America. I've hired a yacht, and we're going to go to the Greek islands." And my aunt thought it was a joke at first, and then suddenly she realized it was true. And then she said, "I asked Miss Ethel," that was her dressmaker, the one that she shared with Mrs. John D. Rockefeller too, Mrs. Carnegie, to make her wardrobe, which my aunt didn't need and was very annoyed about. And there was a car to meet her everywhere, you know, and they were on the yacht in no time at all. And the next year they went around the Cape in South America. What is it? Cape of Horn, is it?
Sure.
Yeah. Visiting all the capitals on the way and looking at the museums. Then they went to Haiti another time. And this meant a little trouble, since my great aunt had grown up in the South and didn't think that it was quite proper to be socially received by black people. The moment she came to like anybody, they ceased to be black and ceased to be Jewish or ceased to be anything at all. They were just her friends.
The way it should be.
Yeah, but she was very peculiar about this event. And Mrs. Moore said she'd never been so well received in her life. They were so polite. My aunt felt very cheated afterwards.
And Beaton, what was he like? What was it like that you both studied together? What was it like, the two of you at school? Did you dream of the future? Did he then want to be a
Beaton was
photographer?
a very sharp person with an underlying foundation of sentiment and loyalty. But you must remember he came from the industrial north of England. His family made nails, and his father had gone through his share of the money. And Cecil had to do a great deal to help his family. My English family was a military family, originally a landed family in Cornwall, where the youngest son always went into the Army or Navy for generations.
It was your great-grandfather that taught Winston Churchill?
No, my grandfather.
Your grandfather, I'm sorry.
My great-grandfather sold the estate in Cornwall, which produced tin in the rivers. It was panned like gold in California. And that family was given a coat of arms in 1650. My father met my mother. Did I tell you this already?
I don't think we've talked about how they met.
They met on the Empress of Japan coming back from the East. My father in charge of 300 Chinese soldiers raised in the British compound, heaven knows why or how. And they were dressed in the East India Command uniform because there was nothing else. So all these Chinamen were wearing turbans. And my mother and her family were passengers. And then he went to Chicago and got engaged. Went home, borrowed some money from an uncle, and went and married my mother on Christmas Eve in 1903.
And they went back to England to live?
One of the great weddings of the year. And Sissy Patterson was one of the bridesmaids, as were also the Higginbotham sisters, who became Mrs. Patterson, Joe Patterson #1, and Mrs. Crane, the plumbing Cranes, who lived in Ipswich.
Did they then go to England to set up household?
Yes, at Camberley, in Agincourt House, which was filled with Tiffany, Liberty furniture, all sorts of things you'd never think could go together. Things imported from the East, lacquers. And that was very unusual in a military town.
I can imagine.
It was unusual to begin with to have a house. Most people lived in diggings or small places.
Did you come